Chapter 8. Oh, Dixon, can I have a word with you? To its recipient, this was the most dreadful of all summons. It had been a favorite of his flight sergeants, a regular with old-fashioned ideas about the propriety of getting a NCO out of the men's hearing before subjecting him, not to a word, but to an uproar of abuse and threats about some harmless oversight. Welch had revived it as a short maestoso introduction to the allegro con fuoco of his displeasure over each new item in the bad impression Dixon had been building up, and it heralded at best the imposition of some fresh academic task designed conceivably to probe his value to the department. Mitchie, too, had more than once used it to signal a desire to talk and ask questions about medieval life and culture. Give me a second. Alright, so it was Welch who delivered the summons now. Swaying about in the doorway of the little teaching room which Dixon shared with Goldsmith. Intellectually, Dixon could conceive of such a request leading to praise for work done on indexing Welch's notes for his book, to the offer of a staff post on meeting of M. to an invitation to an indecent house party, but emotionally and physically he was half throttled by the certainty of nastiness. Of course, Professor, while he followed Welch next door, wondering whether the subject for debate was the sheet or his dismissal, or the sheet and his dismissal, Dixon reeled off a long stream of swear words in a mumbling undertone so that he'd be in credit, as it were, for the first few minutes of the interview. He stamped his feet hard as he walked, partly to keep his courage up, partly to drown his own mutterings, partly because he hadn't yet smoked that morning. Welch sat down at his misleadingly littered desk. Dixon. Yes, Professor. I have about this article of yours. With all his incoherences, Welch was always straightforward when reproofs were to be delivered, so that this remark was comparatively encouraging. Dixon said guardedly, "Oh, yes. I was having a chat the other day with an old friend of mine from South Wales, the professor at the University College of Abertoir. He is now Abertoir. Athro Haynes. I expect you know his book on medieval it's a weird word. CWMRHYDYCEIRW. Dixon said, "Oh, yes," in a different tone, but still guardedly. He wanted to indicate eager and devout recognition that should not at the same time imply first-hand knowledge of the work in question, in case Welch should demand an epitome of its argument. Of course, their problems down there are very different from the past classes in particular. He was telling me, it seems that in the first year, everybody, doesn't matter whether they're going to go on with history or not, they'll have to get through a certain amount of... Dixon switched off most of his attention, just keeping another of his pauses, said yes, and of course, it's doubly difficult when one doesn't feel very secure in one's I'd work much better, I know, if I could feel settled about. Well, insecurity is a great enemy of concentration, I know, and of course, one does tend to lose their habit of concentration as one grows older. It's amazing how distractions one wouldn't have noticed in one's early days become absolutely shattering when one grows older. I remember when they were putting up a new chemistry lab here. Well, I say new, you could hardly call them new now, I suppose. At the time I'm speaking of, some years before the war, they were laying the foundations about Easter time it must have been, and the concrete mixer or whatever it was. Dixon wondered if Welch could hear him grinding his teeth. If he did, he gave no sign of it, like a boxer still incredibly on his feet after 10 rounds of punishment. Dixon got in with, I could feel quite happy about everything if only my big worry were out of the way. Welch's head lifted slowly like the muzzle of some obsolete howitzer. The wondering frown quickly began to form. I don't quite see. My probation, Dixon said loudly. The frown cleared. Oh, that. You're on 2 years probation here, Dixon, not 1 year. It's all there in your contract, 2 years. Yes, I know. That just means that I can't be taken on to permanent staff until 2 years are up. It doesn't mean that I can't be asked to leave at the end of the first year. Oh, no, Welch said warmly. No, he left it open whether he was reinforcing Dixon's negative or dissenting from it. I can be asked to leave at the end of the first year, can I, Professor? Dixon said, quickly pressing himself against the back of his chair. Yes, I suppose so, Welch said, closing his coldly this time, as if he were being asked to make some concession which, though theoretically do, no decent man would claim. Well, I'm just wondering what's happened about it, that's all. Yes, I've no doubt you are, Walt said in the same tone. Dixon waited, planning faces. He looked round the small, cozy room with its fitted carpet, its rows of superseded books, its filing cabinets full of antique examination papers and of relating to past generations of students, dossiers relating to past generations of students, its view from closed windows onto sunlit wall of the physics laboratory. Behind Welch's head hung the departmental timetable drawn up by Welch himself in 5 different colored inks corresponding to the 5 teaching members of the department. The sight of this seemed to undam Dixon's mind. For the first time since arriving at the college, he thought he felt real, overmastering, orgiastic boredom, and its companion, real hatred. If Welch didn't speak in the next 5 seconds, he'd do something which would get himself flung out with possible question. Not the things he'd often dreamed of when sitting next door pretending to work. He no longer wanted, for example, to inscribe on the departmental timetable a short account, while tricked out with obscenities, of his views on the professor of history, the department of history, medieval history, and Margaret, and hang it out of the window for the information of passing students and lecturers. Okay, where the fuck was that? Nor did he, on the whole, now intend to tie Welch up in his chair and beat him about the head and shoulders with a bottle until he disclosed why. Without being French himself, he'd given his sons French names, no, he'd just say quite quietly and very slowly and distinctly, to give Welch a good chance of catching his general drift. Look here, you old cockchafer. What makes you think you can run a history department, even at a place like this, you old cockchafer? I know what you'd be good at, you old cockchafer. Well, these things aren't as easy as you might imagine, Welch says suddenly. This is a very difficult matter. Dixon, you see, there's a great deal, a lot of things you got to keep in mind. I see that, of course, Professor. I just wanted to ask the decision. When would the decision be taken, that's all. If I'm to go, it's only fair I should be told soon. He felt his head trembling slightly with rage as he said this. Welch's glance, which had flicked 2 or 3 times at Dixon's face, now dropped to a half-curled up letter on the desk. He muttered, "Yes, well, Dixon said in a louder voice, because I shall have to start looking for another job, you see, and most of the schools will have made their appointments for September before they break up in July. So I shall want to know in good time." An expression of unhappiness was beginning to settle on Welch's small-eyed face. Dixon was at first pleased to see this evidence that Welch's mind could still be reached from the outside. Next, he felt a momentary compunction at the spectacle of one man disliking to reveal something that would cause pain to another. Finally, panic engulfed him. What was Welch's reluctance concealing? He, Dixon, was done for. If so, he would at any rate be able to deliver the cockchafer speech, though he wished his audience was larger. "Let you know as soon as anything's decided," Welch said with incredible speed. "Nothing as yet." Left with nothing to say, Dixon realized how wild a notion the cockchafer speech had been. He'd never been able to tell Welch what he wanted to tell him, any more than he'd ever been able to do the same with Margaret. All the time he thought he was bringing the matter of his probation to a head. He'd merely been a winkle on the pin of Welch's invasion technique. Verbal this time instead of the more familiar physical form, but a technique adapted to meet stronger pressure than he himself could hope to bring to bear on it. Now, as Dixon had been half expecting all along, Welch produced his handkerchief. It was clear that he was about to blow his nose. This was usually horrible, if only because it drew unwilling attention to Welch's nose itself, a large, open-pored tetrahedron. But when the familiar, miraculously sustained blares beat against the walls and windows, Dixon hardly minded it at all. The noise had the effect of changing his mood. Any statement that could be battered out of Welch was invariably trustworthy, so that Dixon was back where he started. But how lovely to be back where he started instead of out in front where he didn't want to be. How wrong people always were when they said it's better to know the worst than go on not knowing either way. Or they had it exactly the wrong way around. Tell me the truth, doctor. I'd sooner know, but only if the truth is what I want to hear. When he was sure that Welch had finished blowing his nose, Dixon got up and thanked him for their chat almost with sincerity, and the sight of Welch's bag and fishy hat on a nearby chair, normally a certain infuriant, only made him hum his Welch tune as he went out. This tune featured in the rondo of some boring piano concerto. Welch had once insisted on playing him on his complicated exponential horn gramophone. It had come after about 4 of the huge double-sided red-labeled records, and Dixon had fitted words to it. Going down the stairs towards the common room, where coffee would now be available, he articulated these words behind closed lips. You ignorant clod, you stupid old sod, you havering, slavering get. He intervened a string of unmentionables corresponding with an oompa sort of effect in the orchestra. You wordy old turdy old scum, you griping old piping old bum. Dixon didn't mind the obscurity of the reference and piping. To watch his recorder, he knew what he meant. The examinations were now in progress, and Dixon had nothing to do that morning but turn up at the assembly hall at 12:30 to collect some scripts. They would contain answers to questions he set out about the Middle Ages. As he approached the common room, he thought briefly about the Middle Ages. Those who profess themselves unable to believe in the reality of human progress ought to cheer themselves up, as the students under examination had conceivably been cheered up by a short study of the Middle Ages. The hydrogen bomb, the South African government, Chiang Kai-shek, Senator McCarthy himself, would then seem a light price to pay for no longer being in the Middle Ages. Had people ever been as nasty, as self-indulgent, as dull, as miserable, as cocksure, as bad as art, as dismally ludicrous, or as wrong as they'd been in the Middle Ages? Margaret's way of referring to the Middle Ages. He grinned at this last thought, then stopped doing that on entering the common room and catching sight of her, pale and heavy-eyed, on her own near the empty fireplace. The relations hadn't altered materially during the 10 days or so since the Artie weekend. It had taken him the whole of an evening in the Oak Lounge and a great deal of expense and hypocrisy to get her to admit that she still had a grievance against him, and more of the same sorts of commodity to persuade her to define, amplify, discuss, moderate, and finally abandon it. For some reason periodically operative but impossible to name, the sight of her now filled him with affection and remorse. Rejecting coffee in favor of lemon squash, for it was a hot day, he got some from the overawed woman at the serving table and went through the chatting groups over to Margaret. She was wearing her Artie get-up, but had discarded the wooden beads in favor of a brooch consisting of a wooden letter, M.A. large envelope full of examination scripts was on the floor beside her chair. A falsetto explosion from the coffee urn across the room made him start slightly. Then he said, "Hello, dear. How are you today?" "All right, thanks." He smiled tentatively. "You don't sound as though you mean that." "Don't I? I'm sorry. I'm perfectly all right, really." She spoke with extraordinary sharpness. Her jaw muscles looked tight as she was suffering from toothache. Glancing about him, he moved closer, bent forward, and said as gently as he could, "Now, Margaret, please don't talk like that. It's quite unnecessary. If you don't feel too good, tell me about it, and I'll sympathize. If you feel all right, that's fine. Either way, we'll have a cigarette on it. But for God's sake, don't try to pick a fight with me. I don't feel like one." She moved abruptly on the chair arm she was sitting on so that her back was to everybody in the room except Dixon, who saw that her eyes were filling with tears. As he hesitated, she gave a loud sob, still looking at him. "Margaret, you mustn't," he said in horror. "Don't cry. I didn't mean it." She gave a furious downward wave of her hand. You were quite right," she said shudderingly. "It was my fault. I'm sorry." "Margaret." "No, I'm the one in the wrong. I bit your head off." "I didn't want to. I didn't mean to. Everything's so bloody this morning." "Well, tell me about it then. Dry your eyes. You're the only one that's nice to me, and then I treat you like that." However, she took off her glasses and started blotting her eyes. "Never mind about that. Tell me what's wrong." "Oh, nothing. Everything and nothing." "Did you have another bad night?" "Yes, darling, I did, and it's made me terribly sorry for myself, as usual. I keep thinking to myself, oh, well, what's the use of anything, especially me? Have a cigarette." "Oh, thank you, James. It's just what I want. Do I look all right?" "Yes, of course. Just a little tired, that's all. I didn't get off till gone 4. I must go and see the doc and get him to give me something. I can't go on like this." "But didn't he say you got to adjust yourself to doing without anything?" She looked up at him in something like triumph. "Yes, he did, but he didn't say how I'm going to adjust myself to doing without sleep. Doesn't anything seem to help? Oh, God, you know all about the baths and the hot milks and the aspirins and the window shut and the window open." They talked like this for a few minutes while the other occupants of the room began to disperse to their various tasks. These, since it was the one time of the academic year when everybody was simultaneously not lecturing, must have been largely self-imposed. Dixon sweated quietly as the talk went on, trying to repel the persistent half-recollection or half-illusion of having casually told Margaret a couple of days previously that he'd ring her up at the Welch's the next night, which was now last night. Some invitation or promise was obviously required, if only to smother the problem. Our first opportunity, he said, "What about lunch today? Are you free?" For some reason, these queries provoked a partial return to her earlier manner. "Free? Who do you imagine would have asked me out to lunch? I thought you might have told Mrs. Nettie you'd be back. As it happens, she's having a little luncheon party and asked me to turn up." "Oh, well, somebody has asked you to lunch then?" She said, "Yes, that's right," and a puzzle lost way that by suggesting she'd forgotten what she just said or even what they were talking about. Succeeding in alarming him more than her recent tears, he said quickly, "What sort of a lunch party is it?" "Oh, I don't know," she said with fatigue. "Nothing startling, I imagine." She looked at him as if her spectacles were becoming opaque. "I must go now." Slowly, with inefficiently, she started looking for her handbag. "Margaret, when shall I see you again?" "I don't know. I'm a bit short of cash until. Shall I get Nettie to ask me down for tea at the weekend?" "If you like. Bertrand will be there, though." She still spoke in an odd, expressionless voice. "Bertrand, oh well, we better leave it then." With an almost imperceptible increase in emphasis, she said, "Yes, he's coming down for the summer ball." Dixon felt like a man who knows he won't be able to jump on to the moving train if he stops to think about it. "Are we going to that?" he said. 10 minutes later, it having been established that they were going to that, Margaret was on her way out, all smiles, to lock up her exam scripts, to powder her nose, and to phone Mrs. Welch with the news that she wouldn't, after all, be attending the luncheon party, which had turned out to be much of less importance than it had at first appeared. Margaret would instead be lunching off beer and cheese rolls in a pub with Dixon. He was glad that this trump card had had such a spectacular effect, but, as is the way with trump cards, it had seemed valuable enough to deserve to win 10 tricks, not just the one. It had looked better in his hand than it did on the table. He had in his possession, however, two pieces of information of which Margaret was ignorant. One was a connection, whatever it was, between Bertrand Welch and Carol Goldsmith, which had suddenly leaped up again in his thoughts at the news from Margaret that Bertrand was taking Carol to the summer ball, her husband being committed to go to Leeds as Welch's legate for the weekend. Presumably Bertrand's blonde and busty Callahan piece had now, to her credit, been discarded. The interest of the situation was compensating in large part for the likelihood that Carol, Bertrand, Margaret, and himself would be going to the ball together, as a little party, Margaret had put it. The second thing Dixon knew and Margaret didn't was that Bill Atkinson had previously agreed to meet him in the very pub he and Margaret were now about to go to. Atkinson's presence would be a valuable standby in case of renewed difficulty with Margaret, though God knew there shouldn't be any of that so soon after the playing of the trump card. And his taciturnity would rule out any risk of their arrangement to meet being suddenly and untowardly revealed. But more important than any of that, Atkinson and Margaret had not yet met. Trying to imagine what each would say to him about the other afterwards made Dixon grin to himself as he sat down to wait. God only knew how long for Margaret. To fill in some of the time, he found some college stationery and began to write. "Dear Dr. Catan, I hope you will not mind my troubling you, but I wonder if you could let me know when my article,